Our next speaker is the eminent Terence Del Troy of Columbia University. Dr. Del Troy will speak about the Inca Empire, political power, and economic structure. Please help me welcome Terence Del Troy. Terence.
Left, right, and there's a pointer right there.
Hello. I'm going to give the second half of Tom's talk. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's in fact a true honor to be invited to speak to so many colleagues, public, friends from Andean nations. I've had the opportunity to work in the Andes since 1975. And my first experience in the highlands of the Andes, in the Central Highlands, was under the direction of none other than Ramiro Matos. So he introduced me to the highlands of Peru, where I conducted my archaeological field work, and I'm very grateful to him for that. So it's a pleasure to come back here and be able to say a little bit on behalf of the Incas in this symposium. I'd like to congratulate him and the organizers of this grand event for putting on such a successful program. It is a great honor to be able to be one of the public faces of a presentation for which so many people have done so much work behind the scenes. The folks at the Smithsonian, at the National Museum of the American Indian have been working on this for a long time, and my contribution is very small. We're going to be hearing a great deal about the extraordinary Inca road system from our colleagues today and tomorrow, and my goal here is really to help explain the context, why the road came into being, why have a road? What's the purpose of it? What was the organization of power? What were the means by which the Incas sought to dominate the Andes? So what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit how did Inca rule work? And why was the road system an essential part of the governance? I'm going to leave to the subsequent presenters. And as you can see from the title of my talk here, I've been asked to speak about politics and economics, but it's not clear that such a division of concepts would have made sense to the Incas themselves. They viewed social and cosmic order as an integrated whole that envisioned people as only one of an array of beings and powers that operated within a unified social space. The living, the dead, deities, animate beings of the landscape, and a kind of life force all interacted with one another in a complicated array of mutual dependencies and possible competitions. So to speak about the Incas dominating the landscape or dominating the other people of the Andes, in some sense makes a great deal of sense, but they were also constantly negotiating. They were constantly beseeching. They were constantly trying to make a space for themselves in a land that contained both human and non-human actors. So to understand how Inca politics and economics works, we need to have some idea about how they thought the world and the cosmos worked, and how to be successful within it, and what their goals may have been and how they may have changed over time. And a series of related subordinate questions include things like, who were the main actors in Inca rule? How did they think that power worked? And how could order be instilled and maintained? And I have to say, it's not very often that I get 2 full hours to speak in front of an audience like this. You'll be glad to hear that this is not one of those opportunities. Okay. So let me start out by saying that the Inca Empire is often seen as an outlier in comparative studies of pre-industrial empires or pre-modern empires, as Tom already pointed out. Scholars, and especially those working in the Old World, can run down a checklist of missing features that collectively mark Tawantinsuyu as an anomaly in the grand scheme of human history. The scope of the perceived problems is daunting. The Incas had no writing system that we've been able to decipher today, so write the whole thing off. In fact, if you look at the histories of writing, major overviews of writing, which include 1,000-page tomes, there's nothing from South America. It's as though a meaning-based way of representing ideas, which is what the Incas and so many of their other compatriots in the Andes used what's called the semasiographic system, that is a meaning-based system. That simply does not count as some sort of intellectual endeavor in recording information systematically and then passing it on to other people. And yet the Incas had a very, very sophisticated knowledge base and a very sophisticated means of passing that on. It did not approximate alphabetic writing, and therefore it is often dismissed by scholars who work in other parts of the world. So when people run down that list of things that are missing from the Andes, they frequently say they didn't have writing, therefore it couldn't have been a sophisticated society. That couldn't be more wrong. There was no effective waterborne or wheeled transport, nor any draft animals that could be mounted or harnessed to pull vehicles. They were faced with the challenge of ruling societies that ranged from the Chumu Empire, perhaps 3 million people, to the self-governing villages of the eastern lowlands and a population that ultimately outnumbered them by about 100 to 1. That is, if you take maybe 120 people and you line them up from the Andes, one of them is an Inca and 119 are something else. Okay? So that created an enormous challenge. How does such a small polity, maybe 100,000 people out of Cusco, for which there were perhaps 20,000 able adults, rule an empire of 10 to 12 million people? This was the challenge that they faced. 2/3 of the populace lived above 3,000 meters. That's basically 10,000 feet, where they faced extraordinary environmental challenges with only a Bronze Age technology at hand. With a few notable exceptions, Andean societies had no money. They had no markets. They had no commerce. They had no tax in kind that could effectively sustain state activities. The Incas themselves had no notions of capital, investment, return, or profit. How do you run an economy without those ideas? Very briefly, this is a cross-section of the Andes showing the coast up to the high mountains, Cordillera Negra on the west, Cordillera Blanca on the east side with the high mountain valleys here. Most of the people in the Andes lived at an elevation between here the Quechua zone over into the inner valleys and then over to the eastern slopes. Then you get the lower jungles over on that side. So despite all of those problems, the Inca realm is also renowned for its organization and accomplishments, many of them in arenas that we treat as politics and economics today. The first Spaniards to see Tawantinsuyu practically ran out of superlatives in describing it, whether they were talking about the political order, the exquisite stone architecture, the majesty of the leadership and their ceremonies, or the infrastructure of roads and support facilities. During its century-long run of power, the four parts together was the largest polity ever seen in the indigenous Americas, or independent Americas. It counted 10 to 12 million inhabitants in a territory that encompassed about 1 million square kilometers, as Tom has already told us. To impose order on the empire, the Incas created a complex administrative system, though we should not think of it as a formal bureaucracy. It was not that. Local leaders were drafted in positions where they served as mediators between the Inca state and subordinate populace. And they kept systematic censuses and precise tabs on a vast array of resources and products. They extracted labor duties, taxes were mostly in the form of labor, from some 2 million taxpayers, which provided the foundation for state and aristocratic institutions and activities. Their road system linked some 2,000 state installations, traversing, as we've already heard, mountain peaks, desert, and jungle, along 40,000 kilometers of routes from modern Colombia to central Chile. The rulers undertook massive land modification programs, most notably by terracing mountain hillsides and harnessing the water flowing off the highest glaciers of the Western Hemisphere. And they could field armies in excess of 100,000 effectives, apparently without exhausting the land. To explain how the Incas put their imperial enterprise into action, let's take a moment to consider how they understood the world to work. This, in turn, will help explain how they thought relationships were constituted on matters that we call political, such as decision-making, administration, and adjudication, and economic, such as property, labor, exchange, natural resources, and products. An essential point is that the Incas maintained social and interactive relationships with the world around them. Elements of the land that Western thought would treat as natural resources or the environment were, for the Incas, living entities with whom they shared a social space. Many features of the earth were powerful beings, Tirakuna, as fully as alive as humans, Urunakuna. Mountain peaks, the Apu. Springs, meadows, rock outcrops, and other such things were sentient gendered actors with kin relationships, will, agency, rights of ownership, sentiments, and histories. In this light, the earth itself was a living female. We've already heard about Pachamama, rather than being a physical thing nurtured or inhabited by a goddess. The mountain peaks were among the most powerful beings of the landscape, creators of the weather and the owners of the flocks. People just basically used the flocks. They had use rights. The mountain peaks owned the flocks. They were surpassed only by the celestial beings Sun, Inti, and Moon, Mamakia, along with Mother Sea, Mamacocha, and Earth Shaker, Pachacamac. The water that flowed from the glaciated peaks to irrigate the soil and bring forth its fertility was understood to be the mountain seed. Together, the Tirakuna formed a social world that paralleled humanity's, and were fully integrated with it in some contexts. As a corollary, no separation existed between the spiritual and the physical, as everything in the cosmos lay within the same integrated reality. Within this framework of viewing the world, we can suggest that the Incas were seeking to fulfill three main ambitions, which addressed both practical and intellectual issues. The first, most obvious, end was simply to dominate and exploit the peoples and resources of the Andes to the benefit of the overarching polity and its institutions. On a second, narrower basis, the Inca royal kin were intent on expanding their collective holdings, both to venerate their ancestors and to develop estates that would allow them to live in the conditions of wealth and status that they aspired to attain. And third, they were intent on positioning themselves as the necessary intermediary between humanity and other powers of the cosmos, both present and past. That last objective provided the rationale for imposing their own sense of order, and thus civilization, on a world they saw as chaotic and dangerous without their dominion. Those integrated goals meant that the Incas had to instill order not just in a varied human realm, but in a world whose inhabitants included a vast array of non-human actors. How then did they seek to attain those goals? Okay, so I'm going to walk through a few slides here now, talking a bit about the main structural features of the Inca political organization. We need to start out, as Tom pointed out, by observing that the Incas were a latecomer in Andean society. There were many very complex state and imperial societies before the Incas. I illustrate just a few of them here. The Moche Society here, which is probably a state-level society dating from around 100 to maybe 800 AD. Two major highland polities of Wari and Tiwanaku. Wari may in fact have had its own empire here, and Tiwanaku had an expansionist polity here, dating to the first millennium AD, and then the Chimu, which was, or the Empire of Chimor, which was the largest competitor to the Incas, having somewhere between 1 and 3 million people and covering 1,000 kilometers of the north coast. So the Incas built on prior statecraft. They used technologies, they used ideas from previous societies, particularly the Wari, the ideas of building a series of provincial administrative facilities, a road system, the Quipu knot recording system, all had upwards of 800 to 1,000 years of antecedent history among the Wari before the Incas actually came along. So they were very, very deft at using ideas and practices and organizational strategies that had preceded them. Now, the Incas wrote that in their own histories that there had been 13 kings before the arrival of the Spaniards. This, we think, is a condensed history. The representation here I have is of Manco Capac, who was the founder. Viracocha Inca was the first person who is said to have had some sort of expansionist aspirations, but he was really shortchanged by his son Pachacuti, or Inca Yupanqui, Kusi Yupanqui, who usurped the throne from him, took over rule. According to the conventional history, around 1438 AD, we think something like that may have happened a little bit earlier. He was then followed by Tupa Inca Yupanqui, who was the great conqueror, Huayna Capac, who was the last undisputed ruler, and then the last two rulers, Huáscar and Atahualpa, who had a great dynastic war between around 1528 and 1532 when the Spaniards arrived. In fact, Huáscar had just been captured by Atahualpa at the time that Francisco Pizarro captured Atahualpa. So basically what you have is two Inca contestants for the throne. Atahualpa, who had won the contest, being captured by the Spaniards, at the same time that the loser in that civil war was being held by the victor's army. Atahualpa had Huáscar executed, and the Spaniards, after extracting a ransom over 8 months, executed Atahualpa, in part for regicide, but largely because they feared keeping him alive. So what we have is an Inca history which says you have 3 generations of imperial rule, during which they constructed this vast organizational system. This is one representation of the 13 Inca kings. The Incas, like many Andean societies, organized their social formation, their political formation, into 2 parts, an upper part and a lower part, Anan Cusco and Urin Cusco. So we see lower Cusco there, upper Cusco on the bottom there. Essentially what we're looking at is a series of 5 successive kings in each part, in each half. And when a king died, he left the throne to one son, and then left all of his holdings to probably a brother, and then all of the other kin who would hold those resources and venerate him in perpetuity. This is a representation. This is one of the Inca royal headdress, mascarpacha. And if we kind of push things into a Western concept of political order, what we have here is a representation of how the structure looked at the heart of royalty. We have the ruler, the unique lord, the Sapa Inca, who was at the heart of power, beneath which were the 2 sides, the upper and the lower parts of Cusco. And then you have within those upper and lower parts of Cusco, those descendant kin groups, that is the offspring of the preceding rulers who were still present, holding a lot of resources, and venerating the mummy of their ancestor, who was considered to be still a living being. That is, a mummy was someone who was in a purified state, who was still capable of being interacted with. And the Panaka were very, very powerful players in this organization. They would speak to their ancestor. There was a male and female medium who would speak to both the king and the queen, who were mummified, listen to their counsel, and then provide that counsel during court sessions. So in this sense, the past never disappeared. It accumulated because past rulers were always present. There were always active participants, either them or brother idols, icon, called Waukis. There were always active participants in affairs of state at the royal court. Here we have an illustration by Wamampoma. He sent a letter to the King of Spain in 1613, in which he illustrated one of these royal mummies being born on a litter. The royal mummies were brought out to participate in activities of court, and then they went back for rest at night. So when Francisco Pizarro entered Cusco in November of 1533, a year after the initial entry into Cajamarca in northern Peru, he saw the mummy of Huayna Capac, the last undisputed ruler, seated majestically on a throne in the courtyard facing the main plaza of Cusco. You can actually go into the Roma restaurant now, and you're walking right into that royal palace of Casana. Okay. Now, the other actors in this space included the mountain peaks, like Sacsayhuaray up here. And a lot of the contestation among the political elites occurred over lands, particularly in here, in the Sacred Valley. Those Panaka competed with one another over resources, over power, over people who could provide sustenance to them, to the point that if we look at royal history, there are a sequence of regicides, fratricides, matricides. There's a whole series of people who were effectively removed from active practice in Inca politics because they were interfering with the interests of the people who were still present. In fact, this was taken to such a degree that at the conclusion of the last Inca Civil War in 1532, the victors who had come from Ecuador, come down and conquered Cusco, took a mummy, Tupi Yupanqui, one of the royal ancestors who was one of the great powers, took his mummy outside Cusco and incinerated it. Okay. What was the idea here? What was the point here? Well, the point of incinerating a mummy is that you're removing a living actor from participation in royal politics. So essentially what they were trying to do was rewrite history by removing an actor, and then they were going to reconstruct the political order in such a way that that individual and all of his subsequent followers were effaced from history. So they were no longer players in the grand political realm. So if we're looking at the way the political structure worked, we have a ruler here giving the throne to the next ruler, and then he left a descent group. So every generation, what we're doing is we're adding one more of these royal kindreds to the power politics of Cusco. And there is some evidence that over time, there were at least 5 of these royal kindreds that had the name of being descendant of a ruler, but were not part of the political structure. So it looks like there was a lot of jockeying over time, that there was kind of a formal structure in which kin groups played a role, and if you fell out of favor or you were part of this group that had a complex, unsuccessful coup attempt, you disappeared. And you disappeared from history and structure in the process. This is just give you a very brief illustration of how some of this worked. There will be a quiz on this afterwards. This just shows you a sequence. This is ruler Viracocha. Pachacuti is over there. I just ran out of battery on my brand new laser pointer. Pachacuti, Tupa Inca, Huayna Capac. Essentially what you get here is that in every generation, a brother is murdered. A cousin is removed. An uncle attempts to usurp the throne. He's killed. The mother is put into exile. Every single generation of Inca rulership is not a simple succession from father to son. In fact, it is a contestation between kin groups, with the winner reconfiguring history and reconfiguring the political order to naturalize the outcome. This is one of the reasons why it's so difficult to understand Inca history just from the documents, because what we get from the first documents about 1551 is a history that was reconfigured for the times, that was told to the Spaniards by the people who'd survived those last contests. As I said, I'm going to need 2 hours here. Okay. Upper Cusco, people lived in Upper Cusco. The higher status people lived in the upper part, lower status in the lower part. They practiced grand ceremonies in the Alcapata, the Terrace of Repose. They had these wonderful royal estates, which could have anywhere from, they could have upwards of 6,000 to 8,000 people, families working on them for a single ruler. They built vast, wonderful terraces. These are some of the Llama caravans. Okay, now, how do things work in the provinces? This is where we're going to start bringing in the economics a little more quickly. The Incas only had one kind of organization which was not necessarily representative of all the kinds of social forms in the Andes. In fact, the peoples who were like the Incas occupied that kind of red blotch up there. The people on the coast were far more well organized. They're far more sophisticated in their political order. They had a higher degree of social complexity. So what the Incas basically did was they took the social formations, the Ayu, which Tom was talking about a little earlier, that is a corporate kin group that held resources in common. And they took that kind of local community model and then writ that large as a way of explaining and justifying how Inca rule worked. This is a picture of the range of different ethnic groups that lived in the Andes. There were literally hundreds of them, and our vision is a bit like fractal geometry here. The closer we look, the more refined, the more detailed the ethnic picture looks. Okay, now, the Incas installed a complex administrative hierarchy, a decimal hierarchy, where they essentially grouped households into units of 10, units of 10 down here, and then up to 50, 100, 500, all the way up to units of 10,000. So a given province in the Inca Empire, in this central part, would have maybe 10,000 or 20,000 households administered by a central governor. And that governor had these kinds of responsibilities. He administered state directives, mobilizations for war, maintenance of state resources. He conducted a census, administered the state colonists, adjudicated disputes, and maintained facilities such as provincial centers, roads, bridges, and storehouses. A lot of the records were kept on these Kipunat records, which is probably, as I mentioned earlier, a semasiographic system that is a meaning-based system rather than an alphabetical, linguistically based system. They built this vast road network of about, I'm going to have to update this map after this conference, obviously. But we have about 40,000 kilometers of road here with 2,000 tampu, or storage facilities. And the greatest of these facilities could contain as many as 15,000 people at a time. This is a picture of Huanacopampa, the largest administrative facility in the central highlands of Peru. There were basically three kinds of activities that were conducted at these administrative centers. One of them would be grand ceremonies on an annual basis. The Incas would call in the local folks. They would put on a week's worth of revelry And after a beer bash where people were thoroughly soused and eaten, they would be given their directives for their labor obligations, their tax obligations for the following year. There were also people who were craft specialists, artisans, who worked for the state here on a permanent or periodic basis. And these administrative centers also served as housing for people working for the state, either the royal retinue itself or soldiers marching through. This is Huanacopampa. We can see the Ushnu, the pyramid platform where the grand ceremonies were conducted, and the Calyanca, or one of the great halls beneath it, which constituted a major form of political administrative locations. At the same time that the Incas were exploiting the local people for their, through a labor tax, they were undergoing a series of transformations. One of the things that they did was they moved around 3 to 5 million people from their native locations to elsewhere in the land. There were several reasons for doing this: diffusing revolts, building locations where people would produce vast quantities of goods, artisanry, textiles, ceramics. And they also established great farms. In this case, what we're looking at are 2 of the great farms that were established. One here in Cochabamba, Bolivia, well, down there, and then Abancay, Peru, where as many as 14,000 people were moved in to work and produce for the Inca on those farms. The products were then stored in these vast storehouses. And then there were a series of individuals who were set to particular tasks. The most renowned were the Acliacuna. These were adolescent girls who were put to the task of, okay, my time's up, I'll give you 1 minute, okay. Who were put to the task of producing textiles like this, and brewing beer, which would then be served to nobles before they were married off to the Inca elites. So I'm going to end on this note. I just want to say a couple of things here, if you just give me 1 second here. When we think of the Incas, we need to think that they operated both systematically and opportunistically. Okay? They requisitioned productive resources for state temple and state uses. They set up an administration to keep tabs on human and other resources. They assessed taxes, largely through command of labor capacity of their subjects, and they massively resettled colonies of subject peoples to places where their positioning made it possible to diffuse resistance and exploit natural resources. The opportunistic principles focused on exploiting particular localized resources and on the use of perceived skills of particular subject groups. This was all cast in roles of mutual obligation that existed for centuries prior to the Incas' appearance on the land. And ultimately, what the Incas were doing, I would contend, is that they were conducting 2 imperial projects simultaneously. One was organizational and concerned with practice. One was intellectual and concerned with legitimacy. Both of these contributed to imperial power. The organizational was designed to bring order to the realm and to exploit its resources for the ruling Incas. A central part of the latter endeavor, that is the intellectual, entailed periodic reshaping of the canon of imperial knowledge. To effect changes, the Incas employed a complex mix of narratives with public performances, such as at the central plazas, which reenacted or reinforced social relations and historical events. Those acts were performed on memory landscapes, which provided a socialized environment that could be manipulated to shape a constant interplay between past and present, an interaction that we continue to practice today here. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you.